When I got the job at the rest stop, I thought it would be easy money. Late night shifts, minimal human interaction, and nothing but coffee refills and truckers to deal with. I needed something quiet after my last job burned me out, and this seemed perfect, or so I thought. I showed up for my first shift at 10 p.m. sharp, expecting a quick orientation and a list of cleaning duties. Instead, Tom, the wiry old manager with a permanent frown etched into his face, handed me a folded piece of paper. His hand lingered for a moment, making sure I took it. "Follow these to the letter," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't ask questions, just do as it says. If you don't, you'll regret it." "Sure thing, boss," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "What is this, the rest stop rulebook?" Tom didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. "I'm not kidding," he added, pressing the paper into my hand. "This place has rules, and you'll find out why soon enough." His tone sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. As he walked away, I unfolded the paper and read the rules under the flickering fluorescent lights. Each line made my chest tighten a little more. Rule 1. If someone wearing a cowboy hat asks for coffee, hand them an empty cup and look away. I read it twice, trying to make sense of it. An empty cup? Look away? It sounded like a prank, but the handwriting was shaky, the kind you'd expect from someone writing in a hurry or out of fear. Rule 2. Never refill the napkin dispensers after dark. They'll be full by morning. This one made even less sense. Napkins that refill themselves? I figured it was some quirky inside joke among the staff. Rule 3. If the clock strikes 3:60 a.m., turn off all the lights and do not look outside until 4:01 a.m. By this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. The phrasing felt deliberate, like someone had experienced something horrible and was desperate to make sure no one else did. Rule 4. If the lights flicker 3 times in a row, lock the doors, turn off lights, and wait until it's quiet again. My stomach twisted. Why wait? What could possibly happen? I thought. Rule 5. If you hear knocking from inside the supply closet, do not open it, just leave. The final rule sent a shiver up my spine. I glanced at the supply closet door, just a few feet away, and suddenly it seemed far too close. I stuffed the paper into my pocket, determined to prove this was all nonsense. But as the night went on, I learned the hard way, the rules weren't a joke. They were warnings. And I broke one on my very first shift. It was just past midnight when the door chime rang. The place was dead quiet, and I'd almost fallen asleep at the counter. He walked in like he owned the place, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dusty cowboy hat that looked like it had seen better days. His boots made heavy, deliberate sounds against the tile floor. He stopped at the counter and stared at me. Not a glance, not a polite acknowledgement, a full-on, unblinking stare. His face was blank, but his eyes felt wrong, too sharp, too aware. "Coffee," he said, his voice like gravel. I froze. Then I remembered the rule. My hands trembled as I grabbed an empty cup and slid it across the counter. "Here you go," I said, trying to sound normal. I couldn't help it, and I looked at him briefly as he reached for it. His face was old and worn like leather. I could have sworn I saw a hole in his cheek, but before I could get a better look, I heard him shout. "What are you looking at?" he screamed. "All you damn waitresses are the same!" I quickly looked at the floor and walked back to the kitchen. I heard him pick up the cup, but he didn't drink it. He stood there for a moment longer before turning and walking out. I finally looked up just in time to see him disappear into the dark parking lot. Later, when I went to clean the counter, I noticed the cup still sitting there. It was full of cold coffee. Not the fresh brew I'd made earlier. This was thick and sludgy, the kind you'd expect to find sitting for days. I dumped it without a second thought, but the smell of it lingered long after. Later that night, as I was stacking bags of chips when I heard the alarm on my phone go off, I checked the wall clock and it read 3:60 a.m. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't prepared. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed ominously, and I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end. I scrambled to the door and locked it, then hitting the light switches and flipped them all off. The rest stop plunged into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the vending machines, casting eerie shadows across the room. I hid behind the counter staring at the clock. Then came the sound. At first it was a faint tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the glass door at the front. Tap, tap, tap. My chest tightened as I stood frozen behind the counter. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Whoever it was wanted me to look. I heard them pulling on the door, shaking it, trying to get it open. I thought I should call the cops, but I had left my phone in my purse. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the entire building shuddered, as though something massive had slammed into the front door. The vending machines flickered, and the air grew icy. My breath came out in white puffs. I stared at the clock on the wall, willing it to move faster. The second hand crept forward, agonizingly slow, until finally it hit 4:01 a.m. The oppressive cold lifted, and the lights from the vending machines steadied. I couldn't take it anymore and peeked around the corner. All I could see was the silhouettes of 5 men walking away and disappearing into the shadows. I stayed behind the counter until the sun rose. After surviving my first night at the rest stop, I learned to take the rules seriously. They weren't arbitrary or designed to scare me. They were warnings. Each rule had a reason, and every violation brought consequences that could cost you your life, or worse. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when rules number 2, number 4, and number 5 came into play. It was my second week on the job. I was feeling more confident, or maybe just numb to the fear. The rules still freaked me out, but I figured if I stuck to them, I'd be fine. The guy with the cowboy hat came in almost every night. It got to when I saw him walking in. I'd just place an empty cup at his spot on the counter and walk away. Thankfully, the 5 men never came back. The 4th rule didn't make sense to me at first. Why not look outside? What wasn't I supposed to see? I found out that night when the lights started acting up. It began with a single flicker, the kind you don't even notice at first. Then came the second flicker, and my stomach dropped. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the third. I ran back into the kitchen to hide. I forced myself to stare at the wall, so I was not tempted to look outside. That's when I noticed the red and blue lights flashing through the window. Then I heard the voice over the loudspeaker. "Come out with your hands up. We have you surrounded." I couldn't move. I was terrified. Were they talking to me? Is someone hiding in or near the diner? I just wanted to scream. I closed my eyes, put my hands over my ears, and buried my face into my knees. I don't know how long I was like that, but when I looked up, I didn't see the lights anymore. I uncovered my ears and suddenly heard the bell ringing at the counter. I walked out and saw a trucker standing there. "You taking a nap down there on the floor, honey?" he said, before asking, "Could I get a cup of coffee?" I looked out into the parking lot, and except for his rig sitting out there, it was empty. No cops, no lights, nothing. As he took the cup of coffee from me, he spilled a bit on the counter. He reached for some napkins, but the dispenser was empty. He picked it up and shook it at me, saying, "Better get that filled up." Then he turned and walked out the door. I was still a little shaken up over the events of the evening so far. Without thinking, I grabbed a fresh stack from the kitchen and started refilling it. The moment I placed the first few napkins inside, the air changed. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew faint, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. The room felt colder, and then I smelled it, a mix of cheap perfume and stale cigarette smoke. It was strong, clinging to the air like someone had just walked past me. I turned around, and that's when I saw her. She wasn't fully there, more like a faded photograph come to life. An older woman in a tattered waitress uniform, her lips painted bright red and a cigarette dangling from her fingers. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move. "That's my job," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "Leave it alone!" She grabbed the ones I had just put in there and scattered them across the floor. When I looked back up, she was gone, but the smell lingered, and the dispenser was full. I couldn't deal with it. I grabbed my purse and went to the front door, propped it open and pulled out a cigarette. I just saw a ghost, and it told me off? Then it filled the napkin dispenser? I said out loud. WTF. I was halfway done with the cigarette when I heard it. Rule number 5. It started with a faint knock, barely audible over the hum of the vending machines. Knock, knock. I froze, snapping the cigarette in half as my head slowly turned back to the hallway. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone was kicking the door from the inside. Knock, knock, bang. It was coming from the supply closet. After what I had been through tonight, I flicked the cigarette to the ground and noped right out the door, ran to my car and went home. I texted the owner letting him know what happened that night. He replied almost immediately as if he was expecting the message. He said, "That's okay, you did the right thing. Take tomorrow off, but will you come in the next night? I'll be sure you're working with someone." I agreed and replied with a thumbs up. I work at a rest stop on a deserted highway, Part 3. But I couldn't stop wondering, why do these rules exist? What happened here to make this place like this? My curiosity gnawed at me. As I drove into work, I needed to ask someone. As I pulled up to the diner, I saw Dave walking to the door. Dave was in his mid-40s, a gruff and quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. He'd worked here for years, and if anyone knew the truth, it was him. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when I finally got the courage to speak up. "Hey, Dave," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you know why we have those rules?" He froze for a moment, then let out a long sigh. "I figured you'd ask sooner or later," he said. "All right, kid. You want to know? I'll tell you, but you ain't gonna like it." I nodded, and he sat down across from me at the small table in the break room. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes distant, as if remembering something he'd tried hard to forget. "It happened about 15 years ago," Dave began. "This place used to be just another rest stop on the highway. No weird rules, no ghosts, no whatever the hell we're dealing with now. Just a regular spot for travelers to grab a coffee or use the restroom. But then, one night, everything changed." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. It was late, almost 4 a.m. when a group of guys came in. 5 of them. They were wearing masks and carrying guns. A robbery. The kind you'd see in a movie. They told everyone to get down and started cleaning out the register. But it wasn't enough for them. Dave's voice grew quieter. There was a waitress working that night. Her name was Linda. She'd been here for years. Knew every regular, remembered their orders. She was kind. The kind of person who didn't deserve what happened. He paused, his jaw tightening. One of the guys decided to make an example out of her. They dragged her out from behind the counter and... He stopped, taking another sip of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. They shot her, right in front of everyone, and that's when things started going wrong. "The first rule came from one of the robbers," Dave said. The leader of the group. After they killed Linda, he strutted around the place like he owned it, wearing this old cowboy hat. But when they tried to leave, cops showed up. They were trapped. Dave's eyes darkened. Shots rang out and the leader was eventually shot in the chest. He just walked up to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down. He wouldn't stop staring into it. He died right there at the counter, but some say he's still here, wandering in and out, asking for coffee he'll never drink. "Linda loved this place," Dave continued. "Even after what happened, it's like a part of her stayed behind. The napkin dispensers, she used to refill them every night, without fail. After she died, they started refilling themselves. At first we thought it was some weird coincidence, but then people started seeing her. She'd show up just for a second, standing by the counter in her uniform. You could smell her perfume, the faint scent of cigarettes." Dave shook his head. "But if you try to do her job, she doesn't like that. It's her way of saying she's still here, still taking care of the place. If you mess with the napkins, you're messing with her. And trust me, you don't want to piss her off." Was the time when the thieves came into the diner, setting all this in motion. I don't quite understand it, but when the clock changes to 3:60, it means they are coming, and you need to lock the doors and hide. He rubbed his temples, his voice strained. One time, a rookie didn't lock the doors. We couldn't find him the next morning. He was just gone. No blood, no struggle, nothing. Just gone. So now, when the clock reads 3:60 a.m., you lock the doors and wait. Whatever's out there can't get in if you don't let it. When the cops showed up as the lights were flickering, Dave said, and the crooks looked outside and saw their biggest fear. Every time it happens now, something can sense your fear, but it will only come in if you look outside to see it. It shows up differently to people. Sometimes it's a pack of wolves, others it's a group of clowns. I've even heard someone say it was the cops, and that sounds like the worst one, because the evil is playing out the night it happened, trying to recreate the horrors of that night. Dave's expression turned grim. That closet, that's probably the worst part. A father pulled his wife and kids into the closet when the bullets started flying. Then, when the smoke cleared and the cops entered the diner, they heard a banging coming from the closet. By the time they got the door open, both kids and the wife had passed, and the father, who took a round through the neck, he bled out with hatred in his eyes. Something evil is in there now. Just completely stay away from it. It's the heart of this mess, especially when you hear the tapping. Dave finished his story and stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Now you know, he said. But knowing doesn't make it any easier. Just stick to the rules, kid. They're all that's keeping this place from swallowing us whole. As he walked away, I sat there, staring at the list of rules in my hand. They didn't feel like guidelines anymore. They felt like a countdown. I hope you liked the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or even leave a comment.